The legend of the Sands of Time begins with a young, nameless prince standing on a ridge overlooking the opulent Maharaja's palace in India. He is a youth defined by a desperate, burning desire for legacy. In the lore of the House of Shahraman, a prince is nothing until he has proven himself in the fires of conquest. Beside him is his father, King Shahraman, a man of iron and honor, who has launched this invasion not for mere gold, but for the glory of the Persian Empire. However, the true architect of the conflict is the vizier, a traitorous advisor to the Maharaja who has promised the Persians untold riches in exchange for his own survival. The lore of the vizier is the story of mortality's fear. He is a dying man, his body withered by age and disease, searching for a way to cheat the grave. He directs the Persian army toward the Maharaja's most guarded secret, a vault containing a gargantuan, golden hourglass and a crystalline dagger. During the chaotic siege of the palace, the prince separates from the main vanguard, driven by the reckless ambition of youth. He infiltrates the Maharaja's private treasury, a place the lore describes as the sanctum of frozen time. There, he discovers the dagger of time. To the prince, it is a beautiful trophy, a blade with a translucent hilt filled with a glowing golden vapor. To the vizier, it is the key to the universe. The lore of the dagger is that it is the only vessel capable of harvesting and controlling the raw essence of the sands. The prince, unaware of the cosmic weight of the object, claims it as his own, narrowly escaping a collapsing vault. This is the first stitch in the shroud of fate. By taking the dagger, the prince has inadvertently become the guardian of the very force that will soon destroy everything he holds dear. The Persian army returns to the Sultan's palace in Azad, carrying the hourglass as a gift for their ally. This is where the lore of the Sands of Time is truly unveiled. The vizier, playing on the Sultan's curiosity and King Shahraman's pride, convinces the prince to use the dagger to unseal the hourglass. He claims it will reveal a marvel that will make the Sultan's name immortal. Despite a warning from a captive Indian princess, Farah, the prince plunges the dagger into the seal. In that moment, the Pandora's box of Persia is opened. The sands are not a treasure, they are a temporal plague. As they erupt from the glass, they do not merely kill, they rewrite. Every living soul in the palace, including the king and the sultan, is instantly transformed into a horrific, sand-fleshed monster, trapped in a state of eternal, mindless agony. The prince remains unchanged only because he holds the dagger, while Farah is spared by her enchanted medallion and the vizier by his mystical staff. The lore of the sand dwellers is one of absolute tragedy. These creatures are the echoes of the living, soldiers and servants who are now puppets of the sands, compelled to kill any living being to absorb their life force. The prince stands in the ruins of the grand ballroom, watching his father turn into a sand-shrouded beast. The warrior's dream has become a living nightmare. The vizier demands the dagger, revealing his true intent, to use the sands to become an immortal god. The prince, spurred by a sudden, sharp clarity of guilt, refuses and flees into the depths of the palace. The journey begins here, not as a quest for glory, but as a desperate struggle for atonement. The architecture of the Azad Palace becomes a character in its own right, a sprawling labyrinth of shattered grandeur. The lore of the Palace of Azad is that it was built as a celebration of life, but it has now become a tomb where gravity and time are no longer stable. The prince must navigate collapsing towers and trap-filled corridors, realizing that the sands are slowly eroding the very reality of the world. He encounters Farah, and though their kingdoms were at war, they realize they are the only two people left who remember the world as it was. Their relationship is built on the lore of shared trauma and fragile trust. Farah knows the secret of the sands, while the prince holds the power to reverse them. Together, they begin the long ascent toward the top of the palace, where the hourglass has been moved, hoping to find a way to turn back the clock before the sands spread beyond the city walls and consume the world. The second chapter of the lore follows the prince and Farah as they navigate the hollowed-out carcass of the Palace of Azad. The environment, once a symbol of the Sultan's hospitality, has been twisted into a liminal trap. The sands have permeated the very foundations, causing stone to float and time to stutter in localized pockets. The lore of this segment focuses on the burden of the medallion and the dagger, the two artifacts that prevent the prince and Farah from becoming the very monsters they are forced to slay. As they move through the Sultan's private baths and the vast, hanging libraries, the prince is forced to confront the ghosts of his ambition. Every sand dweller he strikes down was once a person he knew, a soldier he commanded or a servant who poured his wine. This constant violence is a mirror of consequence, showing him the literal cost of his desire for glory. The relationship between the prince and Farah evolves into the emotional heart of the story, defined by the lore of the archer and the swordsman. Farah is not a helpless captive. She is the last survivor of a civilization that understood the sands far better than the Persians. She represents the wisdom of the East, constantly challenging the prince's impulsive nature. Their interactions are a delicate dance of suspicion and growing affection. The prince, used to being obeyed, must learn to listen. Farah, used to her role as a princess, must learn to trust the son of her kingdom's destroyer. This alliance of the damned is tested as they reach the Hall of Learning, where the vizier's influence is strongest. Here, the lore of the visions of the hourglass begins to haunt the prince. He sees flashes of a potential future where he is a king, but a king of ruins. The architecture of the palace reflects this internal struggle, particularly in the Great Tower of Azad. The climb is a vertical pilgrimage, moving from the dark, blood-stained pits of the dungeons toward the light of the upper towers. The lore of the acrobat's grace is central here. The prince's ability to defy gravity is not just a skill, but a metaphor for his attempt to rise above his own mistakes. However, the sands are a heavy anchor. The prince begins to rely on the dagger's power to recall time, undoing fatal falls and combat errors. The lore of temporal regression is introduced as a dangerous addiction. Every time the prince turns back the clock, he is essentially refusing to accept the finality of his actions. Farah serves as his moral compass, reminding him that the only true way forward is to reach the hourglass and reset the world properly, rather than living in a loop of his own failures. The act culminates in the Sultan's menagerie, where the prince faces a transformed creature of immense power, the Sand King Shahraman. This is the narrative's moment of absolute loss. The prince is forced to fight the mutated remains of his own father. The lore of this battle is the death of the father image. To save himself and Farah, the prince must strike down the man whose approval he once craved more than life itself. As the king dissolves into a pile of golden dust, the prince's youth officially ends. He is no longer fighting for his father's legacy. He is fighting for his own soul. This tragedy solidifies his bond with Farah, as she is the only one who can witness his grief. They stand on the high balconies of the menagerie, looking up at the hourglass glowing like a dark sun at the summit, realizing that the vizier is not their only enemy. The weight of their own history is just as heavy. The third movement of the lore finds the prince and Farah within the royal chambers and the subterranean aqueducts, a journey that transitions from a physical climb to a psychological immersion. After the devastating loss of King Shahraman, the prince's bravado has completely evaporated, replaced by a quiet, brooding vulnerability. The lore of the Bond of the Nameless is explored here. In the quiet moments between the clashing of blades, the prince and Farah share stories of their childhoods, not as royals, but as children. Farah tells him of her mother and the secret word of Kakalukia, a symbol of safety and childhood wonder. This word becomes the anchor of humanity in a world that has become unrecognizable. The prince, in turn, begins to see Farah not as a prize of war or a tactical asset, but as the only thing that makes his continued existence meaningful. Their relationship is the lore's sacred flame, the only light in a palace that has been consumed by the vizier's shadow. As they descend into the deep wells to find a path around the vizier's magical barriers, the atmosphere shifts from grand tragedy to claustrophobic horror. The lore of the underworld of Azad reveals the physical decay of the palace foundations. The sands have seeped into the water table, creating sandbat swarms and mutated creatures that dwell in the dark. In these lightless depths, the prince's reliance on the dagger's glow is his only comfort. However, the tension between duty and desire reaches a breaking point. The prince begins to fear that if he succeeds in reversing time, he will lose Farah, for in a world where the sands were never released, they would still be enemies, and she would still be his prisoner. This paradox of the heart makes the prince hesitate, a momentary lapse in resolve that the vizier's magic begins to exploit. The act reaches its climax in a sequence of profound betrayal, not from Farah, but from the prince's own exhaustion. After a grueling battle in the statue of the Sultan, the prince and Farah find themselves in a hidden tomb. While the prince sleeps, overcome by the physical toll of his journey, Farah takes the dagger. The lore of Farah's choice is often misunderstood as a simple theft, but it is actually an act of altruistic desperation. She realizes the prince's hesitation and fears that his love for her will stop him from doing what is necessary. She takes the dagger to face the hourglass alone, leaving him with her medallion to protect him from the sands. The prince awakens in the dark, stripped of his weapon and his partner, facing the ultimate night of the soul. He must navigate the final traps of the palace without the ability to turn back time, forced to face the finality of death for the first time since the journey began. Part 4: The Hourglass of Atonement and the Reset of Fate. The final chapter of the Sands of Time lore takes place at the apex of the Great Tower, where the hourglass stands as a pillar of golden light against the starlit sky. The prince, having fought through the darkness with nothing but his father's sword and his own grit, arrives just in time to see Farah's final stand. The lore of the sacrifice of the archer is the narrative's emotional peak. Farah, attempting to strike the hourglass, is overwhelmed by the sand dwellers. She falls from the heights of the tower, and the prince, reaching for her, can only catch the blade of the dagger as she slips away. Her death is the final price of hubris. The prince stands alone atop the world, holding the dagger, looking at the vizier who offers him everything: immortality, power, and the life of his father, if he will only hand over the blade. The lore of the decision of the prince is the rejection of the vizier's nihilism. The prince realizes that the only way to honor Farah and his father is to erase the version of himself that caused their deaths. He plunges the dagger into the top of the hourglass, uttering the word Kakalukia. This act triggers the Great Rewind, a cosmic reversal of every event since the Maharaja's palace. The world unspools. The dead are brought back to life, the ruins are rebuilt, and the sands are sucked back into the glass. The lore of the temporal reset is that only the prince, as the one who struck the final blow, retains his memories. He wakes up in the Persian camp on the night before the invasion, a man with the soul of a veteran in the body of a youth. The story concludes with a clandestine meeting. The prince infiltrates the Maharaja's palace, not as a conqueror, but as a messenger. He finds Farah in her gardens and tells her the entire story, warning her of the vizier's treachery. The lore of this final dialogue is a masterclass in bittersweet resolution. Farah does not know him, yet she feels a strange pull toward the stranger who speaks with such sorrow. When the vizier arrives to kill them both, the prince slays him in a duel of pure, unbridled skill, finally ending the threat that started it all. The prince returns the dagger to Farah, and as he disappears into the forest, she asks him his name. He responds with the only word that proves his story was true: Kakalukia. The legacy of the Sands of Time lore is the story of a hero who never was. The prince saved the world, but in doing so, he ensured that no one would ever know of his heroism. He is a king without a chronicle, carrying the weight of a deleted decade in his heart. The palace of Azad remains unruined, his father remains alive, and Farah remains safe. But the prince is forever changed. A man who's seen the face of time and emerged with the wisdom that some treasures are better left buried in the sand. To truly grasp the finality of the Sands of Time and the heavy transition into the epilogue of dust, one must zoom out from the corridors of Azad and look into the metaphysical framework of the universe itself. This overview is the final, essential chapter in the lore of the prince's youth, a deep dive into the hidden mechanics of a reality that was broken and then stitched back together with a needle made of golden sand. The lore of the temporal loom suggests that time in this universe is not a rigid, unchangeable river, but a fragile tapestry of possible threads. When the prince plunged the dagger of time into the great hourglass, he didn't just release a physical substance. He committed a divine trespass, tearing a hole in the very logic of existence. The sands are not merely magic. They are the primal fabric of the universe in a raw, unrefined state. In their natural form, they are the breath of the world, but when filtered through the vizier's malice and the prince's desperation, they became a temporal infection that sought to rewrite the world into a chaotic, mindless reflection of its own trauma. The central pillar of this overview is the concept of the burden of the singular witness. In the lore of the sands, memory is the only anchor that remains when time is unspooled. This is the tragic core of the prince's character development. While the Great Rewind restored the dead and rebuilt the palace, it did not, and could not erase the shadow timeline from the prince's mind. To every other living soul in Persia and India, the catastrophe at Azad never happened. To King Shahraman, the war was a routine conquest. To the Sultan, the hourglass was just an exotic curiosity. But for the prince, the world is a graveyard of memories that no longer exist. This creates a dual existence, where the prince is a man living in a world that is essentially a ghost of his own making. He is forced to walk through the palace halls and see the faces of guards he saw mutated into monsters, and servants he saw murdered, now smiling and going about their day. This dissonance of reality is what transforms the prince from the vibrant, arrogant boy of the intro into the brooding, hyper-vigilant warrior. He is the only man on earth who knows how close the world came to absolute annihilation. The role of the vizier in this metaphysical overview is that of the eternal catalyst of decay. Even though he is executed by the prince at the end of the game, the lore posits that the vizier is a recurring archetype of human hubris. He represents the universal fear of death, the terror of the final second. In every version of the timeline, there is a man who seeks to steal time to hide his own mortality. The vizier is the mirror image of the prince. While the prince uses the dagger to fix his mistakes and save others, the vizier uses the dagger to feed his own ego. Their struggle is the symmetry of the dagger, a battle between the desire to control the future and the courage to accept the past. The vizier's death is not just a tactical victory. It is a rejection of the idea that time is a resource to be hoarded. However, as the prince later learns in the Forgotten Chronicles, the death of one vizier does not heal the temporal scar left on the world. The void left by the sands is like a vacuum, drawing in darker, more primordial forces like the Dahaka. The lore also explores the anointing of the flesh. Because the prince held the dagger during the Great Rewind, his physical body has been tinged by the sands. This is a crucial piece of lore that explains his near-superhuman agility and his sixth sense for danger. He is no longer purely human. He has become a temporal anomaly. His eyes carry a faint, golden hue that only appears in low light, and his heartbeat is said to pulse with the rhythmic grinding of the hourglass. This anointed status is what makes him a target for the universe's natural immune system. The lore of the debt of the rewind suggests that the universe tracks every second that is stolen or undone. By saving his own life and the life of his father, the prince has created a massive temporal deficit. The overview reveals that the peace he finds at the end of the sands of time is not a resolution, but a stay of execution. He is a man living on borrowed time, and the interest on that loan is paid in the darkness and dread that begins to haunt his dreams in Babylon. Finally, we must examine the legacy of the word, Kakalukia. This word is more than just a childhood memory of Farah. In the lore, it is the vibrational key that proves the impossible is true. When the prince whispers this word to Farah in the final scene, he is performing an act of metaphysical proof. It is the only thing that survives the rewind, a bridge between the timeline that was destroyed and the timeline that was restored. It represents the incorruptibility of the soul. No matter how many times time is turned back, certain truths, like the prince's love for Farah and his growth from a boy to a man, cannot be undone. This is the unbreakable thread. The prince leaves the Maharaja's palace not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of a secret history. He accepts the silence and the loneliness of his heroism because he understands that the greatest acts of bravery are those that the world will never have to know about. This overview concludes the Sands of Time era by highlighting the bittersweet sovereignty of the prince. He has saved the world, but he has lost his place in it. He is a king without a chronicle, a hero without a song, standing on the threshold of a new, darker age. The golden light of the sands is fading, replaced by the long, cold shadows of the Dahaka. The prince looks at the sunset over India and realizes that while he has escaped the hourglass, he has not escaped the clock. The war for his survival is only just beginning, and the warrior within is starting to stir in the silence of his secret. The chronicle of warrior within begins in the suffocating shadow of a primordial nightmare, a sharp and violent departure from the fairy tale wonder of the Sultan's palace. 7 years have passed since the Prince of Persia used the dagger of time to turn back the sands and undo the catastrophe he unleashed. In the eyes of the mortal world, he is a hero who saved a kingdom, but in the eyes of the cosmos, he is a temporal anomaly, a jagged glitch in the tapestry of existence that must be smoothed over. The universe possesses a natural immune system, a terrifying entity known as the Dahaka. The lore of the Dahaka is the foundation of this chapter. It is the guardian of the timeline, a creature of smoke, shadow, and impenetrable darkness that cannot be bargained with, delayed, or killed by any mortal blade. Its sole purpose is to hunt down anyone who dares to alter their fate and erase them from the fabric of reality. For 7 long years, the prince has lived as a fugitive, fleeing across the continents, never sleeping in the same bed twice, and hearing the metallic grinding of the beast's roar in every gust of wind. This relentless pursuit has fundamentally transformed the prince. He is no longer the charismatic, somewhat arrogant youth who sought to impress his father with a trophy. He has become a warrior of shadow, a man defined by the survival instinct in its purest and most brutal form. His eyes are hollowed by exhaustion. His skin is mapped with the scars of 1,000 narrow escapes, and his heart has hardened into a cold stone of pragmatism. The lore emphasizes that the prince's royalty has been stripped away by the sheer weight of his fear. He is a king without a kingdom, a soldier without a cause, fighting only for the right to see the next sunrise. This transition is reflected in his fighting style. He has abandoned the disciplined forms of Persian swordsmanship for a feral, acrobatic violence, utilizing 2 blades to dismember anyone who stands between him and his continued existence. He is a man pushed to the absolute brink of his sanity, and it is this desperation that leads him to seek out a forbidden path. Driven by a rumor whispered in the darkest corners of the world, the prince finds an old philosopher, a man who has studied the forbidden annals of the Ahura and the ancient masters of time. The philosopher reveals the existence of the Island of Time, a place that sits outside the normal flow of history. This island is the birthplace of the sands of time, housing the great fortress where the Empress of Time first forged the substance. The prince's logic is born of a dangerous, circular desperation. If he can travel back to the moment of the sands' creation and prevent them from ever being made, the Dahaka will have no reason to hunt him. In his mind, if the crime of using the sands is never committed because the sands do not exist, the punishment of the Dahaka must cease to be. This marks the prince's ultimate defiance against the divine order. He isn't just trying to outrun his fate anymore. He is trying to perform a surgical strike on history itself to cut his death out of the timeline. The prince charters a ship, manned by a crew of mercenaries who do not understand the cosmic stakes of their voyage, and sets sail into the cursed, mist-shrouded waters of the Mediterranean. As they approach the island, the environment begins to react to the prince's presence. The sky turns a bruised purple, and the waves become violent, as if the world itself is trying to prevent him from reaching the shore. The ship is intercepted by a fleet of dark, obsidian-sailed vessels led by Shadi, a lethal, armor-clad lieutenant of the Empress. The battle that follows on the deck of the ship is a visceral introduction to the new lore of the series. The enemies are no longer just sand monsters. They are the minions of the Empress, creatures of dark matter and ancient magic that fight with a synchronized cruelty. Shadi, a master of the twin blades, represents the Empress's will to enforce fate. She mocks the prince's struggle, telling him that the island will be his tomb before he even sets foot on its soil. The shipwreck is the prince's literal and symbolic baptism into the island's lore. As his vessel is shattered by the dark fleet, the prince is cast into the churning sea, losing his crew, his supplies, and his last connection to the civilized world. He washes ashore on the jagged, barnacle-encrusted rocks of the Island of Time, a place where the air smells of ozone and ancient stone. The architecture of the island is a staggering display of temporal engineering. Built across various peaks and valleys, the fortress is a machine of colossal proportions, filled with traps that have stood for millennia. The lore of the past and present is introduced immediately. The prince discovers the time portals, ancient hubs of energy that allow him to shift between the golden age of the fortress, the past, and its decaying ruins, the present. In the past, the fortress is a gleaming marvel of white marble and lush gardens. In the present, it is a moss-covered, collapsing labyrinth where the very ground feels like it is morning. The prince's journey into the fortress is driven by the sighting of Shadi, who is retreating toward the inner sanctum. As he pursues her, he begins to realize that the island is not just a factory for the sands, but a prison for the Empress herself. The lore suggests that the Empress, Kylina, is just as trapped by destiny as the prince is. She has seen the threads of time and knows that a traveler will come from the future to kill her so that the sands can be created from her remains. This creates a tragic, mirroring narrative. The prince is trying to avoid being killed by a beast, while the empress is trying to avoid being killed by the prince. They are two predestined enemies caught in a causality loop, each act of self-preservation only drawing them closer to the very end they seek to avoid. This is the warrior within, the internal struggle to change who we are in a world that insists we are already finished. The chapter concludes as the prince navigates the crumbling ramparts of the fortress, the silhouette of the Dahaka appearing in the distant mist like a mountain made of smoke. The prince stands at the threshold of a massive, iron-bound gate, his blades drawn and his heart pounding with the frantic rhythm of a cornered animal. He looks at the portal of sands and realizes that there is no turning back. He has entered a realm where the laws of man are irrelevant and the only currency is the blood shed in the pursuit of another hour of life. The air is cold, the shadows are long, and the voice of the old philosopher echoes in his mind. A final warning that your fate is a river. You can change its course, but you can never leave its banks. The prince ignores the warning, stepping into the darkness of the fortress, ready to fight the world, the gods, and himself to secure a future that the universe has already denied him. The story of Warrior Within is not a quest for a throne or a lady. It is a war for the right to exist. The stage is set for a series of temporal shifts and brutal encounters that will test the very limits of what a human being can endure before they become a monster themselves. The sands are waiting, the Empress is watching, and the Dahaka is coming. The second chapter of this jagged epic unfolds within the monolithic interior of the Fortress of Time, a structure that exists as a colossal, clockwork heart pumping the blood of history itself. Having survived the shipwreck and the initial assault on the beaches, the prince finds himself in a realm where the architecture is as much an enemy as the creatures patrolling it. The lore of the fortress centers on its dual nature. Through the use of etheric time portals, the prince is forced to oscillate between two disparate eras. In the past, the fortress is a gleaming pinnacle of engineering, filled with golden light, polished marble, and the rhythmic hum of massive machinery that seems to breathe with the vitality of the Empress's power. In the present, however, the fortress is a desolate, moss-choked tomb. The air is stagnant, the ceilings have collapsed into jagged maws of stone, and the silence is only broken by the skittering of sand leeches and the distant, mournful howl of the wind. The prince's primary motivation in this district is the pursuit of Shadi, the black-clad lieutenant who serves as the Empress's hand of execution. As he chases her through the central hall, he witnesses a confrontation between Shadi and a mysterious woman in red. In a rare act of his former nobility, the prince intervenes, engaging Shadi in a brutal duel atop a precarious stone platform. The lore of this encounter reveals the internal rot within the Empress's court. Shadi is not just a servant, but a terrified captive of fate who believes that by killing the prince, she can end the Empress's tyranny over time. When the prince slays Shadi, he saves the woman in red, who introduces herself as Kylina. She claims to be a servant of the Empress, tasked with maintaining the fortress's intricate mechanisms. This is the first great deception of the lore. Kylina is the Empress herself, hiding her identity to manipulate the prince into a series of tasks she believes will lead to his death. To unlock the path to the throne room, the prince must activate the two pillars of the fortress, the mechanical tower and the waterworks. The lore of the mechanical tower is a testament to the clockwork divinity of the ancients. It is a vertical abyss of grinding gears, swinging pendulums, and pressurized steam valves. The prince is forced to climb through the literal guts of time, where a single misstep means being crushed by the relentless forward motion of the fortress's engines. Here, the prince faces the brute, a towering golem of brass and enchanted stone. The lore suggests that these giants were forged using condensed sands, making them mindless extensions of the Empress's will. Fighting the brute is a symbolic struggle. It represents the prince trying to stop a machine that was built to outlast humanity. Conversely, the waterworks provide a hauntingly beautiful contrast. Water in the lore of the island is the anti-sands, the only element that remains pure and resistant to the temporal corruption. The gardens are filled with cascading aqueducts and reflecting pools that serve as the fortress's cooling system. However, the beauty is predatory. The lore of the Garden Tower mentions that the flora here is fed on the life force of intruders, with vines that move like serpents. It is within these gardens that the prince encounters the Dahaka for the first time on the island. The beast's arrival turns the lush environment into a monochrome nightmare. The prince learns a vital piece of lore during this chase. The Dahaka cannot cross flowing water. This revelation turns the waterworks from a mere objective into a sanctuary, the only place on the island where the prince can find a momentary, frantic peace. Throughout his navigation of these towers, the prince begins to notice a recurring, spectral figure watching him from the shadows. The Sandwraith. This creature, with its glowing eyes and charcoal-colored skin, seems to be a harbinger of doom. Yet it occasionally assists the prince by triggering switches or distracting enemies. The lore of the Wraith is a mystery that haunts the prince's journey, a silent reminder that he is not the only ghost wandering these halls. The prince's internal monologue grows darker as he spends more time in the past. He begins to resent the Empress, not just as an obstacle, but as a mirror of his own arrogance. He believes that by destroying her and the sands, he is performing an act of cosmic justice, unaware that he is merely a pawn in a larger, more tragic cycle of preordained betrayal. As the prince successfully activates both towers, the great gears of the central hall begin to turn, aligning the bridge to the throne room. Kylina rewards him with a series of enchanted blades, each more lethal than the last, further encouraging his descent into the role of the destroyer. The lore of these blades, the lion sword and the serpent sword, is that they are vessels of the void, designed to drink the life force of their victims. The prince is now fully armed and prepared for what he believes will be his final confrontation. He stands before the massive doors of the Empress's sanctum, the warrior within having completely supplanted the Prince of Babylon. He believes he is about to break his fate, but the lore of the island suggests that the harder one fights against the web of time, the more entangled they become. The chapter ends with the prince stepping into the throne room, a chamber of impossible proportions where the very air is made of golden dust. He sees the hourglass, the progenitor of all his misery, standing tall behind the throne. He is ready to kill the Empress, ready to end the sands, and ready to walk back into a world where the Dahaka is nothing but a bad dream. But as the doors lock behind him, the silent laughter of the sands seems to echo in the chamber, a reminder that on the island of time, the past is never truly behind you, and the future is already written in the dust of the floor. The third act of this dark chronicle unfolds within the throne room of the Empress, a chamber of staggering celestial beauty that serves as the crucible of the Sands creation. Having conquered the mechanical and botanical challenges of the towers, the prince stands before the woman in red, who finally sheds her mask of servitude. The lore of the Empress's reveal is a moment of profound irony. Kylina admits she is the very deity the prince came to erase. She confesses that she has spent the prince's entire journey trying to kill him through traps and monsters because she, too, has seen her path of destiny. In every vision of her future, a traveler from a distant land arrives to murder her. The prince and Kylina are revealed as two sides of the same coin, two victims of a deterministic universe, each trying to trade the other's life for their own survival. The warrior within is now forced into a battle of pure desperation against a god who fights with the grace of a dancer and the ferocity of a storm. The duel within the throne room is the first major climax of the game's lore. Kylina manipulates the environment with sand tornadoes and slows the prince's perception of time, forcing him to fight at the very edge of his mortal limits. The lore of the Empress's combat emphasizes that she is not merely a warrior, but a force of nature. When the prince finally delivers the killing blow, he believes he has achieved the impossible. He stands over her dissolving form, convinced that by slaying the creator of the sands in the past, he has prevented the sands from ever being made in his present. He envisions the Dahaka vanishing into the ether, its hunt concluded. He gathers his strength and begins the journey back to the present-day shoreline, expecting to find a world where his sins have been washed away by the blood of a goddess. However, as the prince navigates the crumbling ruins of the present-day fortress, the lore takes a sickening, horrific turn. He does not find peace. He finds the Dahaka. The beast is not gone. It is more aggressive than ever, cornering him in the flooded catacombs. In a moment of devastating clarity, the prince realizes the fundamental flaw in his logic, a concept known in lore as the grandfather paradox of the sands. By killing Kylina in the past, he did not prevent the sands. He created them. The lore of the Empress's corpse reveals that the sands of time are literally her remains. By slaying her, her essence scattered and became the very dust that filled the hourglass. The prince didn't break the cycle. He was the primary engine that drove it to completion. He is the reason the Sultan found the sands, the reason his father died, and the reason the Dahaka is hunting him. He is not a hero who changed history. He is the puppet who ensured it happened. This realization breaks the prince's spirit, casting him into the pit of despair. He retreats into the deepest, most lightless foundations of the fortress, a place where the air is cold and the walls bleed shadow. It is here that he finds the tomb of the ancients, an ossuary for the magi who served the empress before the sands were forged. Within this tomb, he discovers a hidden mural that depicts a figure wearing a terrifying, jagged mask. The lore of the Mask of the Wraith is introduced as a forbidden last resort. The mask was created by the Empress as a failsafe, allowing a user to move through time as a spectral entity, existing simultaneously with their past self. The price of this power is absolute. The mask binds itself to the wearer's flesh, slowly draining their life and erasing their identity until they are nothing but a hollow shell of sand and shadow. The prince, with nothing left to lose and the Dahaka's breath on his neck, dons the mask. The transformation is agonizing. His skin turns to ash, his eyes glow with a haunted, ethereal blue, and his voice becomes a chorus of whispers. He becomes the Sandwraith, the very figure that has been shadowing his movements since he arrived on the island. The lore of the Wraith's perspective is a unique narrative device. The prince must now play through the events of the game again, but from the outside looking in. He sees his past self as a reckless, arrogant fool who is about to kill the Empress and doom the world. As the Wraith, the prince's goal is to find a way to intercept his past self and change the outcome of the battle in the throne room without being detected. This chapter of the lore explores the theme of self-reflection. As the Sandwraith, the prince sees the Fortress of Time as a witness to his own failures. He watches his past self interact with Kylina, seeing her fear and realizing that she wasn't a monster, but a woman as terrified of death as he was. He begins to formulate a new plan. He cannot prevent Kylina's death in the past, but he can force her into the present through a time portal. If she dies in the present timeline, her essence will not be available to be collected by the Maharaja in the past, thus truly preventing the creation of the sands. This is a gamble of double causality, a desperate attempt to outsmart a universe that has already proven it can use his every move against him. The act concludes as the Sandwraith reaches the sacrificial altar, the point where the Dahaka originally caught the prince. Using the mask's power to manipulate a localized time rift, the Wraith ensures that the Dahaka takes his past self instead of him. This temporal substitution creates a massive shockwave of energy that shatters the mask of the Wraith, returning the prince to his human form but leaving him as the only version of himself in existence. He is now at the final gateway, armed with the knowledge of his mistakes and a heart that is no longer filled with hate, but with a grim, surgical resolve. He heads back toward the throne room for one final confrontation with the Empress, knowing that this time the warrior within must be more than just a killer. He must be a savior of a history that doesn't want to be saved. With the mask of the Wraith shattered and his past self erased by the Dahaka, the prince stands as a unique anomaly within the fortress. He has successfully navigated the labyrinth of causality, but the weight of his actions has left him physically and spiritually frayed. The lore of this chapter focuses on the reclamation of identity. For the first time since arriving on the island, the prince is no longer a passenger to fate. He is its architect. However, the fortress is reacting violently to this temporal displacement. In the present, the walls of the palace begin to bleed the ichor of time, a golden, viscous fluid that causes the environment to shift and warp. To reach the final confrontation, the prince must navigate the cursed library and the mechanical pit, areas where the architecture has become a sentient trap, attempting to reset the timeline by crushing the intruder who broke the cycle. A pivotal discovery occurs within the hidden archives of the Empress. Here, the prince finds the prophecy of the variable, a set of ancient scrolls that speak of a weapon that does not belong to the sands. This is the lore of the water sword, a legendary blade forged by the magi of a forgotten era who foresaw the tyranny of the hourglass. The scrolls explain that the Dahaka, being a creature of shadow and corrupted time, is vulnerable only to the purest element, flowing water. The water sword is not made of metal, but of solidified reflection, a blade that carries the essence of the primal sea. For the prince, finding this sword is the difference between a tragic ending and a true ending. It represents the one piece of the world that the Dahaka cannot account for, a variable that allows the prince to move from survival to rebellion. The search for the sword takes the prince through the sanctuary of the ancients, a breathtaking cathedral of light and water hidden beneath the mechanical gears of the fortress. This area is the most sacred site in the lore, a place where the air is cool and the corruption of the sands cannot reach. The prince must solve a series of environmental puzzles that require him to redirect the fortress's vast aqueducts to fill a central basin. This process is a spiritual cleansing for the character. As he restores the flow of water, he is effectively washing away the filth of his 7-year flight from fate. When he finally draws the water sword from its pedestal, the blade glows with a soft, azure light that momentarily silences the whispers of the sands in his mind. He is now armed with a weapon capable of killing a god's guardian. While the prince searches for the sword, the lore of Kylina's desperation deepens. From her throne, she senses the shift in the timeline. She realizes that the prince has donned the mask and returned from a future that should not exist. This terrifies her. To the Empress, the prince is no longer just a murderer. He is a temporal plague that refuses to be cured. She begins to use the very last of her power to summon the Griffin of the Void, a massive, spectral beast that guards the bridge to the throne. This battle is the lore's manifestation of institutional resistance, the universe's last attempt to stop the prince before he can reach the catalyst of the sands. The prince defeats the beast not with hate, but with the cold, surgical precision of a man who knows exactly what must be done to save both their lives. The chapter culminates in a tense, final meeting before the gateway of the past. The prince finds Kylina waiting for him, but instead of drawing his sword to kill her, he attempts the great negotiation. He explains the truth of the Sand's creation and the nature of the Dahaka. He offers her a way out. They will travel together into the present timeline. He reasons that if she dies in the present, the sands will never have been available for the Sultan to find in the past, and if she lives, they can both defy the Dahaka together. The lore of this moment is the choice of the warrior. The prince is offering mercy to his greatest enemy, recognizing their shared victimhood. However, Kylina is too consumed by the visions of the loom to trust him. She believes this is another trick to lure her to her death. This act of the lore explores the theme of inescapable perception. Even though the prince has changed, the history of the world still views him as a killer. The prince realizes that words are no longer enough. He must physically force the timeline to bend. He drives Kylina through the time portal into the present, effectively dragging the past into a confrontation with the future. This is the convergence of timelines, a cataclysmic event that causes the fortress to begin a final, total collapse. The stone walls crumble into the sea, the gears of the mechanical tower grind to a halt, and the present day becomes the final battlefield for the soul of the prince. As they emerge into the ruins of the present-day throne room, the atmosphere is heavy with the scent of ozone and the approaching storm. The Dahaka is already there, its massive, shadowy form filling the chamber. But this time, the prince does not run. He stands beside Kylina, the water sword held high, ready to face the creature that has haunted his every waking breath. The lore of Part 4 is the awakening of the rebel. The prince has stopped being a victim of time and has become its master. He is no longer fighting to survive. He is fighting to change the rules of the universe. The fifth chapter of this temporal tragedy brings the prince and Kylina to the ultimate crossroads of existence. The present-day throne room, now a jagged, open-air ruin overlooking the turbulent sea. The lore of this encounter is defined by the variable of the water sword. For the first time in his 7-year flight, the prince does not retreat when the air turns cold and the monochrome shadow of the Dahaka manifests. The beast arrives not as a hunter, but as a cosmic executioner, tasked with removing the final 2 anomalies from the timeline. The lore of the Dahaka's nature is further expanded here. It is revealed that the creature is a mindless force, a vacuum of time that seeks to fill the holes left by those who should not be alive. By bringing Kylina into the present, the prince has created a concentration of temporal energy so volatile that the universe must either consume it or be permanently altered. The battle is a symphony of steel and shadow. As the Dahaka lunges for Kylina, intending to absorb her essence and finalize the creation of the sands within its own void, the prince steps between them. This is the act of ultimate rebellion. Using the water sword, the prince strikes the beast, and for the first time in history, the Dahaka bleeds. The lore of the azure light describes how the sword's elemental purity acts as a poison to the creature's shadowy makeup. Each strike from the prince shatters the infallibility of fate. The battle is not just a physical struggle. It is a metaphysical clash between the will of the individual and the law of the universe. Kylina, seeing the prince risk his life to protect her, finally breaks her own cycle of fear. She joins the fight, using her remaining control over the sands to slow the beast's movements, creating the first true partnership the prince has ever known. The climax of the battle occurs on the precipice of the fortress cliffs. The Dahaka, weakened by the water sword and the presence of the flowing sea below, begins to lose its physical cohesion. The lore of the abyssal dissolution describes the beast's final moments as a chaotic implosion of black smoke and screaming echoes. With one final, coordinated strike, the prince drives the water sword through the Dahaka's core, while Kylina unleashes a surge of temporal energy that blasts the creature over the edge into the churning waves. Water, the element the beast could never master, finally reclaims it. The guardian of the timeline is destroyed, and with its death, the script of fate is burned to ash. The lore emphasizes that this is a victory without precedent. The prince has killed a god's intent and survived. In the immediate aftermath, the atmosphere of the island shifts from one of predatory dread to a hollow peace. The prince and Kylina stand amidst the ruins of the present-day fortress, realizing that they are now the architects of the unknown. The lore of the redemption of the Empress is explored as Kylina looks at her hands, no longer seeing the blood of her destined murderer, but the touch of an ally. She is no longer the cursed deity of the sands, and the prince is no longer the hunted fugitive. However, the cost of their victory is the total erasure of the world's previous history. By preventing the sands from being found in the past, they have undone every event of the first game. The prince's glory, his father's survival, and even the existence of Farah as he knew her. They have won their lives, but they have lost their place in the world. The chapter concludes with the prince and Kylina building a simple raft from the debris of the fortress, preparing to leave the island of time forever. The lore of the unwritten future is the primary theme here. As they sail away, the prince looks back at the crumbling fortress and realizes that the warrior within has finally found rest. He is no longer driven by the frantic need to survive, but by a quiet curiosity about what a life without a predetermined path looks like. He has traded the dagger of time for the water sword, and his fear for freedom. But as the island disappears into the mist, a final, chilling piece of lore is revealed: the echo of the vizier. Because the sands were never created, the vizier was never killed by the prince in India. The lore suggests that while the prince was busy fighting the Dahaka, the vizier was busy conquering the vulnerable kingdoms of the east. The prince's victory over his own fate has inadvertently paved the way for a new, perhaps more human, catastrophe. The weight of choice returns to haunt the prince as he looks toward the horizon. He has saved himself, but in doing so, he may have abandoned his kingdom to a monster he thought he had already defeated. The journey toward Babylon begins, not as a return to glory, but as a march toward a reckoning that the prince never saw coming. The sixth chapter of the lore shifts from the claustrophobic, stone-heavy atmosphere of the Island of Time to the vast, open uncertainty of the Mediterranean Sea. The prince and Kylena sail toward the east on a vessel forged from the remnants of the Dark Fleet, a journey that represents the interregnum of fate. For the first time in nearly a decade, the prince is not being chased. The lore of the calm before the storm explores the burgeoning relationship between these two survivors. They are chronological outcasts, beings who exist in a timeline that was never meant to accommodate them. As they talk, the prince shares stories of the Babylon that was, while Kylena reveals the secrets of the ancient Magi. This travel period serves as a crucial character beat. It is the first time the prince has been able to define himself by something other than his sword or his fear. However, the lore of the shattered timeline begins to manifest through the prince's dreams. As they draw closer to the Persian coast, the visions of the unmade haunt his sleep. Because the prince prevented the sands from ever being created the entire decade of his life, his heroism at the Sultan's palace, his relationship with Farah, and even his father's victory over the Maharaja has been erased from the memory of the world. He is returning to a kingdom that has no record of his deeds. The lore suggests that while the prince has kept his soul, he has lost his legacy. He is a king of nowhere, returning to a land that may not even remember his name. This psychological weight is the true price of the water sword. He has traded his history for his heartbeat. As the spires of Babylon finally appear on the horizon, the tone of the lore shifts from quiet reflection to a mounting, visceral dread. The city is not as the prince left it. Instead of the golden banners of House Shahriman, the sky is choked with a thick, sulfurous haze. The lore of the new war is introduced through the sight of the harbor. Babylon is under a massive, systematic siege. The architecture of the city, once a symbol of order, is being torn apart by colossal mechanical engines that bear a striking, horrific resemblance to the tech scene in the island's mechanical tower. The prince realizes that his interference with time has left a power vacuum in the east. Without the sands to distract or destroy the neighboring empires, a new, terrestrial evil has risen to fill the void. The most devastating lore revelation occurs when the prince witnesses the standard of the vizier flying over the palace. In the original timeline, the vizier died at the end of the first game, a victim of his own greed and the prince's intervention. But in this corrected reality, the vizier was never exposed. He remained the chief advisor to the Maharaja, eventually orchestrating a coup and launching a campaign of absolute conquest across Persia. The lore of the vizier's resurrection is a grim irony. By saving himself from the Dahaka, the prince has inadvertently granted his greatest human enemy a life of unchecked power. The vizier has spent these years searching for the very treasures the prince just destroyed on the island, and his frustration at finding the sands missing has turned his invasion of Babylon into a slaughter. The chapter reaches its climax as the prince's ship is fired upon by Babylonian shore batteries, now manned by the vizier's scourge soldiers. As the ship splintered under the weight of the catapult stones, Kylena is cast into the waves, and the prince is forced to make a harrowing choice: save the empress or save his home. The lore of the broken homecoming emphasizes the prince's total loss of control. He washed ashore not as a conquering hero, but as a drowned rat among the ruins of his father's docks. He finds the streets of Babylon filled with the wailing of the displaced. The people he was born to protect are being rounded up and shackled. The prince sees his father's crown lying in the mud, a symbolic end to the lineage he fought so hard to preserve. The act concludes with the prince standing in the burning shadow of the city gates, looking up at the royal palace. The Dark Prince, as an internal concept, begins to stir here, The prince's grief and rage at seeing his home destroyed are the perfect fuel for a new kind of corruption. He realizes that the war with the Dahaka was just the beginning. The warrior within has escaped the gods, but now he must face the monsters that men become when they are left to their own devices. He draws the water sword one last time, the azure light reflecting off the smoke of his burning home. He is no longer fighting for his life. He is fighting for the memory of a world he accidentally destroyed. The final chapter of The Warrior Within lore is a haunting meditation on the cost of victory. As the prince drags himself from the wreckage of his ship onto the familiar sands of Babylon, he is met not with the embrace of his father, but with the searing heat of a city in its death throes. The lore of the fall of Babylon is the ultimate manifestation of the prince's hubris. By deleting the sands of time from the past, he effectively removed the great deterrent that had kept the political balance of the East. In the original timeline, the vizier was a desperate, dying old man seeking immortality. In this new, sands-less reality, the vizier is a healthy, invigorated warlord who has used his knowledge of the occult to build a terrifying military machine. The prince stands on the docks, watching his home crumble, realizing that the Dahaka was merely a force of nature, but the vizier is a force of human malice, one that the prince himself allowed to exist. The search for Kylina becomes the prince's final, desperate mission in this era. He tracks her through the burning lower districts, witnessing the deconstruction of Persian pride. The vizier's soldiers are not just occupiers. They are scavengers, stripping the gold from the domes and the wisdom from the libraries. The lore of the Empress in exile highlights Kylina's vulnerability. In the Fortress of Time, she was a goddess. Here, in the mortal world of 2026-era logic, where steel and numbers rule, she is a target. She represents the essence of time that the vizier still craves, even if the sands themselves are gone. The prince finds her at the base of the palace walls, but before he can reach her, she is captured by the vizier's elite, Kilun guards. This moment is the lore's cruel irony. The prince saved her from a cosmic beast only to lose her to a human's greed. A profound lore beat occurs when the prince encounters the remnants of the royal guard. They do not recognize him. To them, he is just another refugee with a strange, glowing sword. This is the total erasure of the hero. The prince has no authority, no title, and no army. He is forced to fight through the city as a ghost, a prince of nothing. The lore emphasizes that his struggle is now purely spiritual. He must decide if he will remain the warrior who only cares about his own survival, or if he will become the prince who cares for his people, even if they have no memory of him. As he watches the vizier's flagship dock at the royal palace, the prince realizes that his father, King Shahraman, is likely already dead, slain by a vizier who never feared the dagger of time. The narrative reaches its final, somber conclusion at the overlook of the Hanging Gardens. As the prince looks down at the carnage, the voice of the old philosopher echoes in his mind for the last time. The lore of the cycle of sacrifice is completed here. The prince has realized that you cannot steal time from the universe without paying a price in blood. He saved his life, but he lost his world. He saved Kylina, but he delivered her into a new prison. The warrior within has become a man of constant sorrow, a figure of tragic depth who understands that every victory in the past creates a debt in the future. He stands in the embers of his kingdom, the water sword heavy in his hand, looking up at the tower where the vizier waits. The game ends with a lingering shot of the prince's face, half hidden in shadow, half lit by the fires of Babylon. The lore suggests that the prince we knew at the beginning of the trilogy is dead, replaced by this warrior who has seen the beginning and end of time. He has no more sands to turn back, no more portals to hide in. He has only the present moment and the cold reality of the war he has brought home. The final piece of lore is the uncertain dawn. As the screen fades to black, the prince's journey is no longer about escaping fate, but about the grueling, painful process of taking responsibility for it. The story of Warrior Within ends not with a happily ever after, but with a "what have I done?" The Chronicle of the Two Thrones begins with the hollow silence of a homecoming turned to ash. After the harrowing odyssey through the island of time, where the Prince of Persia defied the Dahaka, he believes he has finally severed the threads of his cursed destiny. Beside him on his vessel stands Kylena, the Empress of Time, a woman whose existence was once a prerequisite for the creation of the sands, but whom the prince has pulled from the brink of non-existence. They sail toward the majestic docks of Babylon, the prince's heart swelling with the hope of redemption. He envisions the golden gates of his father's kingdom and the relief of laying down his sword. However, as the silhouette of the great city emerges, the dream shatters. Babylon is a vision of hell. The sky is choked with the black smoke of 1,000 fires, and the screams of the dying carry across the water. The lore of this opening sequence centers on the temporal paradox created by the prince's actions. By traveling into the past and preventing the sands of time from ever being forged, the prince effectively erased the timeline of the first game. In this new reality, the treacherous vizier was never slain because the prince and the Maharaja never discovered the hourglass. Consequently, the vizier has spent these years festering in ambition, eventually launching a brutal invasion of Babylon to claim the treasures of King Shahriman. The prince's ship is intercepted by siege engines before it can dock. In the chaos of the sinking vessel, Kylena is captured by the vizier's soldiers, and the prince is cast into the harbor. He washes ashore on the rocks of the lower city, realizing that in his quest to change his own fate, he has inadvertently doomed his entire people. As the prince infiltrates the burning city, the architecture of Babylon reflects a civilization in the midst of a violent transition. The streets are now a labyrinth of barricades and mass graves. The lore emphasizes that this prince is a man hardened by years of running. He is a cynical warrior who sees the world through the lens of survival. He witnesses the vizier's sand-wrought army, soldiers mutated by the first leaks of the sands, rounding up survivors. The prince's objective is to reach the palace and rescue Kylena, but he is slowed by the sight of his father's kingdom being dismantled. He finds the streets filled with the wailing of the Magi, a spiritual distress that permeates the atmosphere. The very soul of Babylon is being drained to feed the vizier's hunger for godhood. The narrative reaches a critical juncture when the prince finally reaches the palace courtyard, only to find himself a helpless spectator. He watches as the vizier executes Kylena with the dagger of time. Her death acts as the ultimate catalyst. Because she is the Empress of Time, her blood is the raw material of the sands. As she falls, the sands of time are released with a violent explosion of golden light. This is not the refined sand of the past. It is a corrupted force of nature. The vizier stabs himself with the dagger, absorbing the sands and transforming into an immortal, winged monstrosity known as Zervan. The blast wave catches the prince, throwing him into the crumbling pits of the palace. During the fall, a jagged dagger-tail chain becomes fused into the prince's left arm, acting as a conductor for the corrupted sands that now enter his bloodstream. This moment marks the birth of the Dark Prince, the core psychological theme of the lore. The infection in the prince's arm is a spiritual gateway. The sands speak to him as a cynical voice echoing his own worst impulses. The Dark Prince represents his resentment toward his father, his bloodlust, and his conviction that the world owes him everything. This internal antagonist serves as a constant reminder of the prince's fall. While the prince wants to save his city, the Dark Prince wants to rule its ruins. The lore of the Two Thrones refers to this struggle, the throne of a righteous king versus the throne of a dark tyrant. The prince must navigate the sewers while battling this darkness, which transforms him into a charcoal-skinned wraith whenever his desperation peaks. Furthermore, the lore of the broken lineage is explored as the prince discovers the body of King Shahriman. In this timeline, the king died defending the gates, never knowing his son had returned. The prince's grief is compounded by the fact that he is a ghost in his own home. To the people of Babylon, he is a stranger who brought the storm with him. This isolation is a key narrative driver. The prince is forced to confront the reality that his heroism was often a selfish pursuit of survival. To save Babylon, he cannot simply be a warrior. He must become a symbol of hope. This sets the stage for his reunion with Farah, the Princess of India, who is also a prisoner in this reality. Their relationship, built on deleted memory, becomes the emotional anchor, as the prince must earn the trust of a woman who has every reason to fear the darkness within him. The first act concludes with the prince emerging from the subterranean depths, standing on a balcony overlooking the burning metropolis. The Dark Prince mocks his tears and urges him to embrace the power of the sands to crush the vizier. The prince, however, looks at his father's sword and the distant silhouette of the Tower of Babel. He realizes that the path ahead is a pilgrimage of atonement. The architecture of the city is now a cage that he must break from the inside out. The sands of time are no longer just a tool to undo mistakes. They are a poison he must either master or be consumed by. The journey toward the heart of the vizier's empire has begun, and the prince must walk the razor's edge between his humanity and the monstrous power in his veins. The air in Babylon is thick with the scent of ozone and ancient dust, a reminder that the laws of time are being rewritten. The prince's movement is shadowed by the ghostly laughter of his darker half, the heartbeat of this fractured reality. He is a man with two souls, two legacies, and two thrones vying for his future. As he leaps into the darkness of the next district, the legend of the Prince of Persia enters its final chapter, where the greatest enemy is not the God King on the tower, but the man staring back from the reflection in the sands. The stage is set for a battle that will determine whether time itself will be a river of life or a desert of eternal shadow. The second chapter of this fractured chronicle begins in the claustrophobic darkness of the Babylonian sewers, where the prince is forced to confront the duality of his existence. Having survived the collapse of the palace, he finds himself navigating the city's underbelly, a place where the stench of decay is masked by the metallic tang of the sands. It is here that the Dark Prince fully manifests, no longer just a whisper but a distinct, parasitic consciousness. The lore of the Dark Prince is deeply tied to the nature of ambition. He is the embodiment of the prince's survival at any cost, a creature of shadow who views morality as a shackle. Physically, the infection causes the prince to mutate into a wraith-like form, his skin hardening into obsidian and his arm wielding the dagger tail with a savage, whip-like fluidity. This transformation is fueled by the sands. Without a constant intake of the golden essence, the Dark Prince's form withers, forcing the prince into a desperate, unending hunt for more power. As the prince ascends from the depths into the city's industrial districts, he encounters a ghost of his forgotten past, Farah. In this timeline, she is a fierce commander of the Indian resistance, having been captured by the vizier's forces. The lore of their meeting is defined by the absence of memory. The prince looks at her with the eyes of a man who has lived a lifetime by her side, but to Farah, he is merely a gritty, suspicious warrior who smells of the sands. She is hunting the vizier for the destruction of her own kingdom, and her presence creates a profound conflict for the prince. The Dark Prince urges him to kill her or use her as bait, arguing that she is a distraction from his vengeance. However, the prince finds that in her presence, his darker impulses are easier to suppress. Farah becomes the light that keeps the infection from reaching his heart, even as she remains unaware of the role she played in the world that no longer exists. The architecture of the city's midsection, the mechanical towers, serves as a metaphor for the vizier's cold, calculating nature. These towers were once wonders of Babylonian engineering, used to track the stars and manage the city's irrigation. Now they have been repurposed into execution engines, where the vizier's lieutenants, the gatekeepers, oversee the slaughter of the populace. The prince must master the art of stealth to navigate these areas, a necessity born from his weakened physical state and the overwhelming numbers of the Sand Army. The lore emphasizes that while the Dark Prince excels in open combat, the Light Prince must rely on the wisdom of his father's teachings to survive. This duality creates a rhythmic cycle in the narrative. The prince moves through the shadows with grace and precision, only to erupt into a whirlwind of shadow fire when the Dark Prince takes control. A pivotal moment in this district occurs when the prince and Farah are forced to work together to lower a massive drawbridge. During this sequence, the prince's cynical exterior begins to crack. He finds himself instinctively protecting Farah, repeating maneuvers they perfected in a timeline she cannot remember. This echo of the soul suggests that some bonds are deeper than the flow of time. However, the Dark Prince is always there to remind him of the truth, that their bond was built on a lie and ended in a tragedy he cannot undo. The lore of the two thrones becomes more literal here. The prince realizes that to sit on the throne of Babylon, he must first conquer the throne of his own mind. He begins to see that his father, King Shahriman, was not just a king of stone and gold, but a king of character, a standard the prince feels increasingly unable to meet. The environment of Babylon continues to mutate under the influence of the sands. The market districts, once vibrant and full of life, are now patrolled by the illusionists, sand creatures that can teleport and manipulate the perception of their prey. The lore of these enemies reveals the vizier's mastery over the temporal element. He is not just changing the present, he is thinning the walls of reality itself. The prince discovers that the more he relies on the Dark Prince's power, the more the world around him begins to look like a nightmare. The colors desaturate, the sounds distort into low-frequency growls, and the architecture seems to bend under the weight of his own corruption. This visual storytelling reinforces the idea that the darkness is not an outside force, but a perspective that changes how the prince interacts with his world. The chapter culminates in a confrontation with Klampa, a former Babylonian general who has been transformed into a mountain of sand and iron. This battle takes place in the city's grand arena, once a place of sport and celebration, now a slaughterhouse. The lore of the Klampa fight is a test of the prince's reclaimed heroism. For the first time, he isn't just fighting for himself. He is fighting in front of the hidden eyes of his people. By defeating the giant, he sends a signal to the survivors that the prince has returned. But the victory is hollow. As the giant falls, the Dark Prince's voice grows louder, claiming the credit and demanding that the prince execute the surviving soldiers to finish the job. The prince resists, but the strain of the struggle is visible on his face, a sign that the war for his soul is far from over. As the sun begins to set over the burning spires of Babylon, the prince and Farah stand on the edge of the royal gardens. The path to the vizier is clear, but the prince is more divided than ever. He is a man who loves a woman who doesn't know him, a prince of a kingdom that is being ground into sand, and a host to a monster that wants to consume him. The lore of the two thrones is no longer a legend of the past. It is the reality of his every heartbeat. He looks at his infected arm, the golden veins glowing in the twilight, and wonders if there will be anything left of the man he once was by the time he reaches the top of the tower. The journey continues, but the shadows are growing longer, and the Dark Prince is beginning to smile. The third movement of the lore takes place within the royal workshops and the Hanging Gardens, a vertical labyrinth where the industrial might of Babylon meets its most decadent botanical wonders. This district serves as a physical manifestation of the vizier's corruption of Babylonian progress. The workshops, once the birthplace of the kingdom's greatest inventions, have been converted into flesh forges, where the vizier's alchemists experiment with the infusion of sands into living subjects. The architecture here is a brutalist blend of grinding gears and steam-powered elevators, all powered by the glowing, pressurized sands. The lore of the workshops introduces the concept of the agony of the machine, the idea that the vizier has stripped the soul from the city's industry, replacing human craftsmanship with mindless, automated destruction. For the prince, navigating these halls is a test of his mechanical intuition, forcing him to solve complex environmental puzzles that mirror the fractured state of his own mind. The central antagonists of this chapter are the twin warriors, the vizier's personal executioners. One carries a massive, curved sword, the axe, while the other wields a lethal, bladed chain, the sword. In the lore of the two thrones, the twins represent the ultimate symmetry of shadow. They move in perfect unison, a dark reflection of the partnership the prince is trying to build with Farah. Their combat style is designed to exploit any gap in the prince's defense, requiring him to focus on the rhythmic flow of the battle rather than brute force. The battle against the twins occurs within a circular arena of fire, a symbolic representation of the Ring of Fate. As the prince fights them, the Dark Prince taunts him, claiming that a true king would simply burn the arena down with everyone in it. This confrontation is a pivotal lore moment. The prince must reject the Dark Prince's solo power and instead rely on the strategic timing he has learned from his failures on the Island of Time. The transition into the Hanging Gardens provides a jarring shift in the narrative's atmosphere. The gardens, one of the ancient wonders of the world, are now a dying paradise. The whitewood trees are turning to obsidian, and the waters of life that once flowed through the aqueducts have been replaced by a slow-moving, golden sludge of liquefied sand. The lore of the gardens focuses on the suffocation of beauty. Under the vizier's rule, nature itself is being taxed and drained. As the prince and Farah traverse the high trellises and precarious balconies, the dialogue between them deepens. Farah begins to notice the prince's constant murmuring to himself, his internal battles with the Dark Prince, and her suspicion grows into a genuine fear. She asks him about his past, and the prince's inability to tell the truth without sounding like a madman creates a wall of silence between them. The lore suggests that the prince's greatest burden is not the infection, but the knowledge of a history he cannot share. A significant lore revelation occurs at the altar of the ancestors, a secluded grove within the gardens dedicated to the previous kings of Babylon. Here, the prince finds a statue of his father, King Shahraman, that has been defaced by the Sand Army. This sight triggers a violent reaction from the Dark Prince, who views the king's legacy as a weakness that led to the city's fall. However, the Light Prince sees it as a beacon of responsibility. He begins to understand that a king's duty is to be the foundation for his people, not the ceiling. This realization allows him to tap into a new level of focus, temporarily silencing the Dark Prince's mocking voice. The lore of the altar emphasizes that the prince is finally beginning to mourn his father as a son, rather than just a soldier. This emotional vulnerability is what allows Farah to see a glimpse of the man beneath the scars, momentarily softening her stance toward him. The journey through the gardens also introduces the Mahasti, the vizier's lead assassin and the architect of the palace siege. She is a master of the sands of velocity, able to move so quickly she appears to be in multiple places at once. Her battle with the prince is a high-speed chase through the crumbling gazebos of the upper gardens. The lore of Mahasti is a warning about the cost of speed. She has sacrificed her physical stability and her sanity for the ability to outrun time itself. When the prince finally corners her, he is forced to transform into the Dark Prince to match her speed. This transformation is the most violent scene thus far. He becomes a whirlwind of chain and shadow, a sight that Farah witnesses with pure horror. The lore of this moment is the shattered trust. Although the prince kills Mahasti and saves Farah, the look of revulsion on Farah's face is a wound that no sands can heal. The act concludes at the Great Lift, a massive platform that leads toward the royal palace's inner sanctum. The mood is somber. The prince has reclaimed the gardens, but he has lost the tenuous connection he was building with Farah. The Dark Prince is triumphant, laughing at the prince's misery and reminding him that monsters do not have friends. The lore of the lift symbolizes the prince's final ascent into the lion's denver. He is no longer just fighting to save Babylon. He is fighting to prove to Farah and to himself that he is still a man. The architecture of the palace looms above them, a golden cage filled with the vizier's divine ambitions. The prince looks at his father's sword, now glowing with a faint, internal light, and realizes that the hardest part of the journey is not the enemies he faces, but the man he has to become to defeat them. The lore of Part 3 serves as the crucible of the spirit. It is where the prince's physical prowess is at its peak, but his emotional state is at its most fragile. The Hanging Gardens, once a symbol of life, have become a graveyard of dreams, and the prince is the only one who can decide if the next morning will bring a new season or an eternal winter. He steps onto the lift, the chain on his arm rattling like a funeral bell, ready to face the ghosts of the palace and the god who waits at the summit. The fourth movement of the chronicle descends into the ruined palace of Babylon and the subterranean tombs, a journey that serves as the prince's dark night of the soul. The palace, once the seat of Persian sovereignty, is now a fractured shell, its gold leaf peeling away to reveal the raw, corrupted stone beneath. In the lore of the two thrones, the palace represents the heart of the kingdom, and its desecration by the vizier's sand army signifies the total collapse of the old order. As the prince and Farah navigate the collapsing throne room and the shattered banquet halls, the environment itself seems to remember the prince's father. The lore of the shattered throne is introduced here, the idea that the physical seat of power is nothing without the spiritual weight of the man who occupies it. The prince's struggle is no longer merely about survival. It is about reclaiming the dignity of his bloodline from the shadow that has consumed it. The psychological war within the prince reaches its most feverish intensity during the traversal of the Well of Secrets. As the prince moves through the Dark Prince becomes increasingly aggressive, his voice no longer just a whisper but a cacophony of doubt and malice. He mocks the prince's grief, calling his father's death a mercy, and suggesting that the prince should thank the vizier for clearing the path to the throne. The lore of the psychic parasite is explored here. The Dark Prince is not an external demon, but the concentrated essence of the prince's own ego. He represents the seduction of the void, the belief that the only true freedom is found in the absence of responsibility. This internal conflict is mirrored in the gameplay, as the prince is forced to switch between forms with increasing frequency, illustrating a mind that is literally being torn apart by its own contradictions. The turning point of the entire trilogy occurs in the Chamber of the King, deep within the palace's lower levels. It is here that the prince finds the body of his father, King Shahraman. In the previous games, the king was an unreachable figure of authority, but here he is a silent, fallen warrior. The lore of this moment is the passing of the mantle. Beside the king lies his sword, a weapon of legendary Persian craftsmanship, forged from a metal that resonates with the purity of the sun. The Dark Prince tries to prevent the prince from taking the weapon, fearing its radiant energy. However, as the prince grips the hilt, the corruption in his arm momentarily recedes. The sword acts as a spiritual anchor, a physical link to the honor and wisdom of the man the prince once sought to surpass. By taking up his father's blade, the prince stops being a wanderer and finally accepts his role as the rightful king of Babylon. The discovery of the sword changes the dynamic between the prince and Farah. Seeing him honor his father's memory allows Farah to see the nobility that the sands have been trying to erase. However, this reconciliation is short-lived. The vizier, sensing the prince's renewed resolve, triggers a massive collapse of the palace's foundation. The lore of the Great Descent describes a journey into the city's ancient foundations, where the prince and Farah are separated. The prince is cast into the pit of silence, a place where the sands are so thick they muffle all sound. In this isolation, the Dark Prince tries his most desperate gambit, attempting to convince the prince that Farah has abandoned him and that his father's sword is a useless toy. The lore of the pit is the trial of faith, where the prince must choose to believe in the unseen light of his allies despite the overwhelming darkness of his immediate surroundings. As the prince fights his way back toward the surface, he encounters the Sandwraiths, elite guards who serve as the physical manifestations of the vizier's fear. These enemies are silent, relentless, and move with a spectral grace. The lore suggests that these are not just soldiers, but temporal echoes, remnants of warriors from the timelines the prince has destroyed. This adds a layer of cosmic guilt to the prince's journey. He is literally cutting through the consequences of his own past mistakes to reach his future. The environment of the lower palace is a nightmare of shifting sands and temporal rifts, where doors lead to rooms that haven't been built yet or to ruins that have been gone for centuries. The prince's mastery of his father's sword becomes essential, as its light is the only thing that can stabilize the reality around him. The chapter culminates at the base of the high tower, where the prince finally reunites with Farah. Their conversation here is the emotional climax of the act. The prince, humbled by the sight of his father's death and the weight of the sword, finally speaks to Farah with honesty, though he still cannot tell her the whole truth of their past. The lore of the high tower represents the final ascent. Above them lies the vizier and the culmination of the sand's power, Below them lies the ruin of everything the prince once held dear. The prince realizes that the two thrones are not just symbols of power, but choices of how to face the end of the world. He chooses to climb not for himself, but for the memory of the king and the safety of the woman who has become his conscience. The act ends with the prince and Farah stepping onto the spiral ramp of the Tower of Babel. The air is charged with the energy of the vizier's ritual, and the ground beneath them is no longer stone, but solidified sand. The Dark Prince is silent, lurking in the deep recesses of the prince's mind, waiting for the final moment of weakness. The lore of Part 4 is the death of the scavenger and the birth of the king. The prince has found his weapon, his purpose, and his partner. Now, all that remains is the long climb into the heart of the storm, where the destiny of the sands and the fate of Babylon will finally be decided. The fifth movement of the chronicle takes place within the High Tower of Babylon, a dizzying vertical ascent that transcends the physical world and enters the realm of metaphysical nightmare. The tower, under the vizier's influence, has become a temporal loom, where the past, present, and future of the city are being unraveled and rewoven into a monument for the dark god Zervan. The architecture here defies the laws of gravity. Massive stone slabs float in the golden haze of the sands, and the wind carries the distorted whispers of those already consumed by the ritual. The lore of the High Tower describes it as the stairway to nihilism. As the prince climbs, he is not just fighting soldiers. He is fighting the weight of time itself. The Dark Prince is at his most desperate and vitriolic here, sensing that the completion of the prince's journey will mean his own destruction. He tries to lure the prince into a state of total despair, arguing that even if they defeat the vizier, the world is too broken to ever truly heal. The ascent is punctuated by the vizier's illusions, a series of psychological trials designed to break the prince's spirit. The vizier manifests as a giant, winged silhouette in the storm, casting shadows that take the form of the prince's past failures. He sees the sultan's palace in ruins, the face of the Dahaka, and the tragic end of Kylina. The lore of these illusions explores the concept of temporal guilt, the idea that the prince is a man without a home in time. The vizier taunts him with the fact that he is a ghost, a man whose greatest deeds were erased from history. To overcome these trials, the prince must rely on the sword of Shahraman. Its radiant light acts as a truth seeker, cutting through the vizier's lies and stabilizing the prince's perception of reality. The lore emphasizes that the sword is not just a weapon of iron, but a symbol of the legacy of truth that the vizier can never hope to corrupt. A major lore event occurs at the summit of the Inner Sanctum, where the prince is briefly reunited with Farah. They find the vizier's ritual at its terrifying peak, with the captive population of Babylon being transformed into a literal sea of sand to fuel his godhood. However, before the prince can strike, the vizier unleashes a massive wave of temporal energy that casts the prince into the mental realm, the abyss of the self. This is a surreal, dreamlike dimension that exists entirely within the prince's own mind. The architecture here is a chaotic blend of every location the prince has ever visited, from the temples of India to the fortresses of the Island of Time. This is the Dark Prince's domain, where the shadow finally reveals its true plan, to permanently replace the prince and claim the third throne for itself. The lore of the mental realm is a deep dive into the prince's psyche. There are no traditional enemies here. Instead, the prince must navigate a world of shifting platforms and echoes of his own voice. The Dark Prince manifests as a physical entity, stalking the prince through the ruins of his memories. He argues that he is the true prince, the one who did the hard work of surviving while the Light Prince hid behind his father's honor. The lore of the Shadow's claim is that the darkness is the only honest part of humanity. To escape this realm, the prince must undergo a spiritual decoupling. He realizes that he cannot kill the shadow, because to fight it is to feed it. The only way to win is to stop engaging in the struggle entirely. This represents the ultimate act of self-mastery, the prince choosing to be defined by his actions in the light rather than his fears in the dark. While the prince is trapped within his mind, the physical world reaches its breaking point. Farah, left alone on the tower, attempts to disrupt the vizier's concentration. The lore of Farah's defiance highlights her role as the true hero of this timeline. She is a woman who fights for a world she barely understands, against a god she cannot hope to defeat, purely because it is the right thing to do. Her bravery serves as the beacon that helps the prince find his way out of the mental abyss. He realizes that he is not fighting for his own throne, but for the right of people like Farah to exist without being pawns in a god's game. This shift from self-preservation to selfless sacrifice is what finally breaks the Dark Prince's hold over his spirit. The chapter concludes with the prince awakening on the highest platform of the tower, the apex of Zervan. He is no longer transforming. The charcoal skin and the golden veins are gone, replaced by the steady, calm resolve of a man who has finally integrated his shadow. Beside him, Farah is being held by the vizier's massive, golden wings. The lore of the final dawn begins here. The storm has cleared at the summit, revealing a sky of burning gold and the vast horizon of Mesopotamia. The prince stands before the vizier, holding his father's sword, ready to end the cycle of the sands forever. The Dark Prince is reduced to a faint, powerless whisper in the back of his mind, a reminder of the darkness that will always exist but no longer leads. The lore of Part 5 is the transcendence of the hero. The prince has survived the physical siege of Babylon, the biological horror of the infection, and the psychological trap of his own ego. He has arrived at the end of time, not as a victim of fate, but as its arbiter. The Tower of Babel stands as a silent witness to the final confrontation between a man who has learned the value of a single lifetime and a monster who has lost everything in his quest for eternity. The final movement of the saga takes place atop the apex of Zervan, a platform suspended in the eye of a golden hurricane where the laws of mortality no longer apply. The vizier, now fully transformed into the winged god King Zervan, represents the ultimate stagnation of time, a being who seeks to freeze the world in a state of eternal, unmoving perfection under his rule. The lore of the final battle is a masterclass in thematic resolution. To reach the vizier, the prince must navigate a crumbling environment where the very stones are being unmade. This is the end of the illusion. The vizier's power is shown to be parasitic, built on the destruction of the city below. The prince uses his father's sword not just to wound the vizier's flesh, but to sever his connection to the sands. As the battle reaches its climax, the prince delivers a series of precise strikes that force the vizier to ground, proving that the spirit of a true king is more durable than the vanity of a false god. The death of the vizier is the definitive end of the sands era. As the prince plunges the dagger of time into the vizier's heart, the energy of the sands is released in a blinding flash of white light. In this moment of cosmic equilibrium, the spirit of Kylina reappears. She is no longer the vengeful empress or the hunted victim, but a transcendent being of pure temporal energy. She gathers the sands of time, the dagger, and the dagger tail into herself, removing the corruption from the world once and for all. The lore of Kylina's ascension signifies the closing of the circle. She tells the prince that the sands were a mistake born of human greed, and by removing them, she is giving humanity the greatest gift, a future that is not written in stone. She fades into the ether, leaving the prince standing in a Babylon that is finally, truly free. However, the journey is not yet over. As the physical threat vanishes, the Dark Prince makes his final, most desperate stand within the prince's mind. The prince is pulled into a final dreamscape of the palace, where the shadow attempts to seize the throne of his consciousness. The lore of the Last Temptation is profound. The Dark Prince does not fight with weapons, but with the lure of power. He offers the prince a world where he can have everything back: his father, his kingdom, and Kylina, if only he will let the darkness stay. The prince's victory here is his greatest feat of the trilogy. He realizes that to defeat the shadow, he must simply walk away. He stops fighting, ignores the throne, and follows the voice of Farah toward the light. By choosing to be a man instead of a god, he effectively starves the Dark Prince of the attention and anger that fueled him. The shadow dissipates into nothingness, leaving the prince whole for the first time in years. The prince awakens on the balcony of the palace, the real-world sun rising over a liberated Babylon. Farah stands beside him, safe and free. The lore of their final exchange is a beautiful callback to the series' origins. When Farah asks who he really is and how he knew her name, the prince realizes that while she has no memory of their past, he carries the legacy of every timeline they shared. He is the guardian of the secret history. He doesn't try to force her to remember. Instead, he begins to tell her the story, starting with the iconic words, "Most people think time is like a river that flows swift and sure in one direction, but I have seen the face of time, and I can tell you, they are wrong." This signifies that the prince has found his true purpose, not as a conqueror, but as the storyteller who ensures the mistakes of the past are never repeated. The trilogy ends with the camera pulling back from the palace, showing a city beginning to rebuild. The lore of the two thrones concludes with the theme of acceptance. The prince has lost his father, his original timeline, and the woman he first loved, but he has gained a wisdom that no other mortal possesses. He is the prince of two thrones, the earthly throne of Babylon and the spiritual throne of a man who has conquered himself. The dagger is gone, the sands are gone, and for the first time since he crossed the Indian border all those years ago, the prince is not running from his future. He is stepping into it, one day at a time, alongside the woman who was always his destiny. The legacy of the Sands of Time trilogy is a story of personal evolution. It began with a boy wanting to impress his father with a trophy and ended with a man realizing that the greatest trophy is a clear conscience. The lore of the Ahura and the Persians is left in peace, the cycle of the sands broken, and the river of time allowed to flow naturally once more. The prince has finally earned his rest, leaving behind a legend that will be told as long as there are stars over the desert.